And this is the Freedom Club podcast. I'm your host, Curt Mercadante, and I got to tell you, I am excited about today's episode because I interview the co-author of two of the most important books I've read in the past 2 years. His name is Alex Salkever. He's the former technology columnist for Business Week. He's a columnist for Fortune. He's a writer, a technology expert, a futurist, and he co-authored with Dr. Vivek Wadhwa two, again, of my favorite, the most important books I've read in the past 2 years. The first one is The Driver in the Driverless Car, How Our Technology Choices Can Change the Future, as well as Your Happiness Was Hacked, Why Tech is Winning the Battle to Control Your Brain, and How to Fight Back. We talk about all of this, how technology, how AI is impacting the future of work and work today, as well as how technology may be affecting your productivity, your mindset, and your happiness. So without further delay, here is my interview with Alex Salkever. Alex, thanks so much for joining me on the Freedom Club podcast. How are you doing today?
Very well, Curt. Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it. I read your bio and was super intrigued.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I have, as we talked about offline and in the emails, I've read two of your books that you co-authored with Dr. Vivek Wadhwa. And the first was The Driver in the Driverless Car, which talks about not just the future of work, but I guess the tagline that kind of sums it up is, are we either going to end up with Star Trek or Mad Max? And it talks about AI, jobs, everything from, people think about factory jobs and truck drivers, but teachers, lawyers, across the board. And then your follow-up book is right here, Your Happiness Was Hacked, which some people may not think is kind of a sequel or related, but as you and I talked about, they absolutely are. And they talked about the impact of technology on our lives and, dare I say, on our freedom, and kind of how it influences not only our behaviors, but addictions and sort of the crack cocaine of the smartphone in our hands at every time. So I thank you for writing these books.
No, it was my pleasure, and thank you very much for reading them. I always am honored that people have spent hours of their life reading things that I've produced and written. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, my pleasure. And I think, as I mentioned, the driver in the driverless car, I've become obsessed with thinking about the future of work and what people are prepared or not prepared for. And it's one of those things where, and maybe this is part of our happiness being hacked, is there's so much information coming at us. There's no shortage of stories and news stories about AI and robots and all the truckers are going to go. But maybe it's so much information that we now tune it out. But the book was a serious wake-up call about, people think about certain jobs and unskilled labor, but very skilled labor in terms of surgeons and oncologists and teachers are going to be, entire industries are going to be impacted by technology.
I think that AI will call into question, or at least cause us to think about the very nature of what makes us human and what makes us different. I think often a lot of when people talk about the future of work, they have this illusion that there are certain glorious things that humans can do better than everyone else forever. And oh no, a robot can't do that, or an AI can't do that. When in fact, we as humans may actually prefer the AI to do it, for things like counseling, where you want arm's length, for example, or for decisions on diagnostics. Eventually, probably people will want an AI to do it rather than a human, because AIs with machine vision are better than humans. The patterns aren't totally there yet, but it's getting close really fast.
Yeah, and even and you talk about musicians and the ability for music to do certain things, which also leads it into how we're educating humans today. And is it up to snuff for what's coming tomorrow in terms of, I always like to use the term, why are we training to churn out an army of bots to compete with the bots, when in fact the things that make us unique are the fact that we're human and creativity. And economist Tyler Cowen writes about this in terms of, I joke around that, in the end, when the bots take over, you think of the Terminator, you think of even the Avengers, right? What made Tony Stark so powerful wasn't that he knew a lot of facts and figures. It was that he was creative. It was figure out someone who knows how to switch the button.
100%. 100%. I totally agree with you.
So where is it? How do we start training ourselves, starting in schools, and to make that happen? Well, to make it happen, I mean, we're already probably well behind the 8 ball, right?
So that's also a little bit of a glass half empty view, which I don't totally share.
Okay.
I think that people do put creativity into their lives, and we see it all the time. It may be non-traditional. It's definitely not in the educational curriculum, but you go on places like Etsy or SoundCloud. Some of the things that my son spends a lot of his time doing is electronic dance music, electronic music. And he's involved in communities online. He's creating music. Granted, it's an extension. He also can play instruments. But I think that there's more creativity than ever because the tools are there. I think it's not necessarily recognized. And I think that in that creativity, and really I'd say sort of non-linear thinking, ways of making leaps of logic or creative leaps, that's where the future is, or where what will be the most important for educating our kids. And it's not even like you can totally program that. You have to give them more space, not less, if that makes any sense.
No, absolutely. And we homeschool our kids.
We Waldorfed our kids, which is like homeschool in a school.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I recently had on Carrie McDonald, who wrote a book about unschooling, but talks about the different options out there and kind of schools. And then a few weeks ago, I had on Michael Strong, who runs the Academy of Thought and Industry. And he's close with John Mackey from Whole Foods, has a lot of Silicon Valley investors who kind of realize this in terms of, they use things like the Socratic method and really try to foment, to give the space for people to think versus memorize by rote. What is...
Well, just jumping in quickly there.
Yeah.
I also want to be careful not to paint all liberal arts education with a broad cloth as being horrible. I got some great liberal arts education. I mean, I spent a semester reading Shakespeare and interpreting him. Some of my math classes were amazing, in the ways that they taught me to think about the world. So I think it's much more that trying to standardize too much and trying to kind of make it an industrial process is the problem, as opposed to the educational construct itself.
No, absolutely. And that's what, Michael Strong does. I mean, the Socratic method, they read the classics together, they read Shakespeare, and then they discuss it versus memorize line 4. Memorize, it wrote and teach to the test. And it's interesting in that I don't, listen, I'm a former Chamber of Commerce person, right? And a lot of people don't realize that the Chamber of Commerce is a trade association of businesses who want their self-interest to, and that's not saying they're bad. You just have to realize that it's not the chamber of free market. It's not necessarily the chamber of innovation. It's the chamber of people they represent or companies they represent. And a lot of times, you even hear the local chamber will come out with a list of all the professions that are going to be in demand in 5 and 10 years, and we have to craft everything to that. And we have to standardize our schooling system to that. And we have to construct everything around that. And when you look at some of the jobs they say are going to be around in 5 or 10 years, it's because they don't exist today. But some of them are major manufacturing firms here. And I'm thinking, so you're going to construct the entire community college, technical college system around jobs that I think are not going to be there in 5 years. And so people have to step back and think, all right, where is the source of this data coming from, and do some first principles reasoning and kind of ask these questions of, like you said, liberal arts education. I totally agree with you in the ability to think for yourself and come up with those and creatively think and problem solve is so important versus I'm going to learn how to weld because the Chamber of Commerce says that's the future of work in this town. I just don't.
There's a very good reason why the most popular course on Coursera is learning how to learn. And I think that's just because people intuitively understand exactly what you're saying. And even if you are a great welder, you'll be an even better welder if you're really curious and you look at the process and you think, there's a better way of doing this, or I could do this instead, or something like that. Oddly, in Japan, they you've probably tracked a little bit about this. They instill this in their factory workers, where they have these groups that meet in the factory, just about, and it's part of a continuous improvement process, and everybody's empowered to create suggestions for improving how processes run. So everybody is empowered to be creative, even though they're literally on an assembly line. So it's really hard to kind of bucket things. It's much more of like, how do you think about it, if that makes sense?
No, I think it does, or I know it does. I think it leads into, your happiness was hacked in terms of, there's a lot written, and rightfully so, and it's on all sides. Fake news, right? And the prevalence of things that are coming at us in messages, and it's interesting though, looking in history, when you talk about fake news, the United States has a history of fake news. You go back into the 17 and 1800s, Thomas Jefferson had his own newspaper that he hid behind and would write editorials and put somebody else's name on it. At that point, though, and maybe it was the Enlightenment, and people kind of had this ability to think a little more broadly and problem solve rather than remember by rote. I don't know. We survived that, but is it a sense of? Well, let me ask you. With all these messages coming at us, some fake, some not even in the political realm, right? Today, I'll read a story that if you eat a steak a week, you're going to die. And then tomorrow I'll read another study that if you don't eat steak once a week, you're going to die. And how, and maybe this is part of the education in being able to creatively think and problem solve. How is that affecting our ability to deal with what's coming at us in the future? In addition to, as you write about in your happiness was hacked, how is it hacking our happiness now with, there is the paradox of choice, and we have so many choices, and that's an issue. But when some of the choices we're being provided with are fake.
So I think to the point about freedom, which you talk about quite a bit, of course, an interesting paradox that I find, which I think a lot of people have talked about, I'm certainly not the first to talk about it, is that often you find freedom in rules. So by creating simple rules, you often set yourself free from the noise, set yourself free from thinking about all of these other things, because almost never over the past 60 years, 100 years or whatever, has there been some kind of scientific breakthrough that's basically said steak will kill you, even though people have been eating it for the rest, for the past whatever.
Right.
Michael Pollan was absolutely spot on. He's not about technology, but eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Very simple. It's not rocket science, and none of this actually has to be rocket science. It's the same things with, as this media comes at you, learning how to take it all with a grain of salt, every single bit of it. I think is really helpful. Even when you're facing pretty extreme stuff online, and eventually we will be facing completely fake things online, having the mental distance and being able to frame all of these things as really something that probably isn't that relevant, probably isn't that important, it probably should be put in its place. Now, don't get me wrong, like World War II, when we're facing something like Hitler, yes, it's very serious, horrible problems. Or when you're dealing with North Korea, so there are extremes, but this constant barrage of articles, like you said, about steak, or maybe it's keto diets, or maybe it's kale. I don't know.
Right.
Or do you drink? Do you don't drink? I don't know. Is coffee good for you? Some studies say you should drink 6 cups a day. Others say not at all.
Yeah.
So my mental framework for this and many other things in life is, a little bit, not too much. And just, you should be able to tell when it's too much, because it starts to change the way you think and feel in ways that you don't like. And that's kind of a critical part of self-awareness. And don't get me wrong, I'm not totally into mindfulness. I think mindfulness is useful and helpful, but it's not the end all be all. But being able to remove yourself from yourself and look down and ask these questions like we did in, both in Your Happiness Was Hacked and in
Yeah.
Driving the Driverless, and answer those questions. And that gives you the freedom to try to construct the life that you want and to try to control your mind.
I love what you said about, rules can help create freedom, and, you have order and chaos, and, you look in history, right? If anarchy breeds too much chaos and you have no freedom, too much order, tyrannical regimes, fascism, communism, whatever. All right, that's bad. It's that line in the middle. And in your personal life, some people require a little more chaos, some people require a little more order. But when you have clear guardrails, then you're free to operate in the middle. And, some of the questions you mentioned in the driver and the driverless car, how do you determine what technology or how it is good or bad? You asked, does it have the potential to benefit everyone equally? What are the risks and rewards? And does it foster autonomy and independence? And it dawned on me as I was writing my notes last night that those are three questions you could kind of ask yourself about most activities in your life, aren't they?
And there probably are answers on both sides that are very valid for almost everything you do. It's much more about the act of thinking and being conscious and really understanding what's going on, as opposed to just going along for the ride.
So we talked about AI and technology impacting the future of work and careers and all that. In Your Happiness Was Hacked, we talk about something that is, this news isn't going away in terms of not only privacy, but you talk about the slot machine and kind of the dopamine addictive effects of likes and shares and views and those types of things. One thing I'd love to delve into, because I think it not only affects productivity, but it affects, I think a key to freedom and fulfillment is getting into a state of flow as much as you can. And you talk about the state of flow and the amount of, I've seen really, I was at a startup accelerator in Cairo last year, and everyone just kind of chatting over lunch. There was an argument about whether or not multitasking is a thing. And I said, there's some studies. I think I saw one study that multitasking on a regular basis lowers IQ points, or it's the equivalent of drinking a 6-pack of beer or whatever, and how it's not really multitasking. It's a stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. And you write Gloria Marks with UC Irvine, her studies find that we're on average interrupted from what we're doing every 10 and a half minutes, which prevents us from getting in a deep work state and into a state of flow. And you have some personal experience about how that as a writer has impacted your state of flow.
Very much so. And I want to, so I think a way that I try to think about this is actually from Paul Graham of Y Combinator. And he talks about creator days. So it's impossible not to have interactions with other people. I mean, you need to answer the emails. You probably need to answer Slack if you're in a tech company these days. The question is, how do you carve out that space so flow is possible? But in doing so, when you carve that out, how do you make it sacred so that you stick to that flow state, and so that becomes a space where you can operate and do the deep learning work, like Cal Newport. We've talked about him a little bit, I think. Do the really deep work that is actually the most valuable work. Because I can guarantee you, no company's stock valuation is going to go up, or no product is going to be innovative based on the number of Slack messages that are sent. I mean, maybe someone will come out with that, but and I'll pay them money. But even then, though, part of the problem with flow is that it's not predictable. You can have a flow state set aside, or a flow time set aside, but how can you guarantee that you are going to be in that flow? Now, the most successful creative people over time do have this kind of structure in their lives. Like Jerry Seinfeld, every day spends time writing. Most of the great writers write early in the morning or late at night, one or the other. Rarely do you have people that just sort of hopping in and out and, are very random about what they're doing. I think that the key, for me at least, is finding a job or finding a way of living that allows you to dictate your flow states. And flow states isn't just for writers. I mean, it's for anybody, really. I think it's part of feeling good is having this time to think things through or do work. Now, there's some jobs where you're not going to have flow state. I mean, if you're a customer support rep, right, that's your job, is to talk to as many people as possible. If you're a sales rep, you may have a lot less time for flow state because you're supposed to be on the phone,
Right.
and that's just upfront part of the price of what you're doing. But I really hope that in the future, more companies try to create this flow space for people. And I know some are getting much more aggressive at it. Like, for example, Microsoft, they acquired a startup that looks at what's happening in your calendars and emails and chat, at least all in the Microsoft product. I think they can point at others. And it will tell you how many uninterrupted blocks of time you have each week. And it will start to nudge you in the direction of trying to guard your time. Because they've strongly associated lacks of uninterrupted time with lower productivity and lower team happiness.
Interesting. That's fascinating. And that's a great example of technology to help create some of those guardrails, right? To have freedom in between versus others like a Facebook or
Well, part of it's the guardrails, part of it is the permission. So Microsoft has made it a policy among a lot of their managers that you will give your employees time, uninterrupted time to think and work. It comes from the top. It comes from Satya Nadella, who is a remarkable leader. If you do not have that permission, no matter what technology you have in place, it just won't work. And I think everybody listening to this has experienced the boss who says, "Don't worry about replying to emails on weekends that I send you." Then don't send me the email on the weekend. I mean, just queue them up and send them out on Monday morning. So.
Yeah, it's, this goes back, 10 years, 15 years, trying to have a conversation with someone in their office who is looking at you like this and the computer's off to the side and their eyes keep going over and you have a minute discussion. They're like, hold on. I got to, and then they come back and you can't, it would be a 5-minute discussion, but you talk about a flow state. You can't even get into a flow state or a deep state of conversation because they're constantly going and going and going back and forth.
And it actually will make you angry because I think that's just a deep human nature. So have you experienced, I'm sure you've experienced this, you're on a phone call with someone and the cell service is kind of bad.
Right.
And you find yourself actually getting mad at them or mad because the cell service is bad. It's nobody's fault. But because things don't work the way you want, it makes you mad. Well, the same thing happens when you're in an office and they're checking Slack and email and you can't have a conversation. It's totally, totally negative. There's actually in the book, which you probably read, some really good research on how the presence of laptops, either open or unopened, in classrooms diminishes recall. And that Air Force Academy research. And because of that, a bunch of more forward-thinking instructors at universities are now starting to put in place a no laptops rule, or, which is equally innovative, they're solving the problem by saying, okay, we have two kinds of class sections.
Right.
There's a laptop section and a no laptop section. You can pick.
Interesting. Yeah, it's I love that they gave the choice and how some people probably figured out for themselves, you know what, I'm not recalling this. I'm going to go to the other side of the classroom.
Yeah.
Someone also told me, I had her on this podcast. She was a sales expert and she had she has a sales workbook and you get quarterly and you write through it and you go, and someone had written in to the video I put up about, why don't you have it online? Why do you actually have a physical paper workbook? And she said, because there have been studies that when you actually have a pen and you write, it triggers directly to your brain. And ever since then, I've stopped taking notes, anything. Sometimes I do it on my iPad, but I write with the pen. And just the act of writing, even if I don't go back to my notes, sticks with me more.
There's a kinesthetic nature to it. I mean, it's the same deal with flashcards. Most of the flashcard world has actually flipped to this app called Quizlet, which is, I don't know if you've run into this with your kids. It's ever present. And it's super frustrating to me because in theory, it makes reinforcement learning easier. It helps kids recall stuff. But for me, I remember very, very well the act of writing down flashcards and how it helped me memorize things quickly. And still that's kind of like a dirty little secret of a lot of debaters or a lot of people with great memory capabilities is they do take the time to write things down. And I think that points to something else, which we really, I'm not surprised at, but I think that it's harder for people to think about, which is that usually there are additional layers of what's going on to any type of activity, learning, for example. I mean, at the sort of the most superficial layer, learning is absorbing symbolic knowledge and being able to either regurgitate it or discuss it. But there's lots of other things that may be going on underneath the surface. And we see this in so many different layers of life. Initially, everyone thought the gene was the key to how our bodies interacted with the environment. Now they understand that epigenetics, there's a whole layer underneath that. Now they're starting to understand that gut bacteria can impact all of these things just as much as genetics. And so as you kind of peel back the layer of the onion, you see there's so much more involved. And I'm convinced that learning is precisely the same thing, and that the whole idea of like, oh, I will type it into a keypad and that will be my recall, it's not as simple as that.
When you talk about learning, and this goes back to a little bit to driver in the driverless car, and the fact that I may learn differently than you learn, and you talk about uniqueness, and
we may learn differently at different points in our lives and with different subjects too. It's not like you have one learning style anyway. I mean, everybody has myriad learning styles. Yeah,
right. Absolutely. And I often, it's an overused example, but Thomas Edison, right? They said he had an adult brain. And I talk about our kids. My daughter learns much differently than my son. And if he was in school, he gets overstimulated by having 40 kids around him. He learns at a different rate. And they might,
terrible for boys, full stop.
Yeah, right. When they might say, well, you have a disorder. And she doesn't, and all that.
Well, then they give him a drug.
Exactly. Right. And they, sit in the corner, you're drugged. And I think there was one study that found when it was up to teachers, up to a quarter of boys would be diagnosed with ADHD simply because they couldn't conform to that teacher's teaching style.
Well, I'm also believe that there's probably a connection with the diminution of recess, diminution of PE, diminution of music, all of these other physical activities that used to take place in school, which I think, you don't want to bucket boys versus girls.
Right.
But I think my personal feeling is that boys tend to be more kinesthetic in the way that they learn. And that's, it varies. There's a whole spectrum. But it's pretty clear from the numbers that schools are not serving boys very well.
Well, and on that note, in terms of kind of personalized education, you write about in The Driver and the Driverless Car about education and how it could be impacted in terms of your teacher now is I can't remember if you said hologram, or it's on an iPad, or it is personalized to you and to that child. Does that help? Yes, there might be some job loss that goes along with that, but maybe not.
There absolutely maybe not. I mean, and I think that kind of segues into the future of jobs around the AI stuff, which maybe that wasn't where you're going, but if you go back and look, and I think we've said this in the book, at the list of occupations 100 years ago or so, almost all of them are gone today. There are no milk delivery people. There's nobody in an elevator that's pushing a button. Farm labor used to be a significant percentage of U.S. work, and it's gone. So, I mean, these kinds of things change, and I am absolutely convinced that the market for learning is not going to shrink. And I think that humans will probably play a considerable role in it. It's just, how do we work with AI or systems that can do a better job doing what teachers used to do not very well? Meaning very often broadcast knowledge en masse.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, well, I love that. So looking at your happiness was hacked, and you talk about some of the, asking yourself questions. We talked about some questions that you put forth with AI and technology. I think it was on your Twitter account last night. I think you retweeted, or you tweeted about someone was going onto an airline and they were doing facial recognition without asking permission.
Yeah.
And you talk about permission, and you talk about, we're getting to a point where there's a big debate over Facebook or some of the major, I mean, that's a major airline you're getting on, they didn't ask you permission. Where do you think, government regulation sometimes either lags or makes the problem worse or delays certain things? Where's the happy medium in terms of where the government may have to step in, where companies do what's right, where people tune out? Although, what Steve Wozniak said, get off Facebook if you can. I would like to do that, but I also make money on Facebook. So where is that happy medium? Is it ever going to be found?
No, I think it will constantly be challenging and moving. Part of what's changed is if you look at the rate of technological development and adoption curves of technology, they've gone from kind of like that to like that. So, I mean, if you think back, how long did it take TVs to penetrate the US? I mean, it was decades. How long did PCs become fairly common? Probably 15 years. Cell phones, a decade. Alexa, 4 years. So all of these technology curves are getting steeper, and that's because the technology is getting better. It's developing faster and faster. And so that creates a very difficult burden on government, on regulations, and it forces us to sort of constantly be reevaluating. Is this right? Is this good? Is this something that should require permission? Like another article that you may have seen last week was about how several teams were building giant databases of faces doing things like pulling in a video feed off of a cafe without even telling people that's what they were doing.
Wow.
And there's no law for that. Hasn't been, at least to date. So I think that we're going to be in a constant state of regulation shock, I'd almost call it. And I think that that's incumbent on government to get much faster at what it does. And it's going to be very hard for government to do that. I mean, look at the case of like Uber and Lyft. On the one hand, I think what they did is wrong. You can't just land on a city and drop a bunch of unregulated labor and people doing what they're doing, on that service, that driving service, without any kind of laws. In San Francisco, we had scooters, bikes everywhere, just stacked up. It was complete chaos. On the other hand, the changes that they've brought about are immensely positive. 5 years ago, I could not get off the ferry, go to a bike station, and take a bike to my office easily. If I wanted to get anywhere and I wanted a cab on a Friday night in San Francisco, good luck. I mean, probably wasn't going to happen. So I mean, there's this, and I think that this is going to be constantly going on. Part of what's happening as well about this is that, at least in the most sensitive industries, particularly around medicine, healthcare, the development and testing is moving offshore. So it's moving out of the US because in other parts of the world, governments are either more amenable to the testing or it's less regulated.
Interesting. So you talk about something like somebody pulling videos off a cafe. That's different than giving Facebook permission on my phone, putting an Alexa in my house. So from a personal freedom standpoint, we're not going to opt out of going out in public and going to cafes.
Of course not.
What can we do as much as possible? I know you lay out some questions in terms of, does the technology make us happy or sadder? Do we need it to use it as part of our lives or work? What are some things we can do in our own lives to empower ourselves, to give us that freedom and put some self-regulate ourselves to be as free as possible and feel comfortable with what we're using, not only from a privacy perspective, but from a, smartphone is crack cocaine type perspective?
So if you don't mind, explain to me what context of freedom you're trying to achieve here. Because I see privacy and freedom, they're not necessarily counterindicated anyway.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of, so people are angry about privacy. By the same token, there's a couple issues here with if on my cell phone, right? And the amount of every time I sit there and I get sucked into Facebook, there's a number of problems or a number of issues. Every time I like, comment, share, they're building a profile on me, and I'm leaving my kind of breadcrumb trail. That's one piece. The other piece is, my goodness, I've now spent 2 hours getting sucked into Facebook. So there's the privacy. There's also the kind of, as much as we want to say, listen, I'm an autonomous human being, I can choose not to do it. I mean, there's a real reason, and you write about it in the book. From a mental perspective, from the dopamine effect, the addiction effect, how can we empower ourselves to deal with not only the privacy issues? I guess they're separate things. I'm kind of probably wrongly conflating them, but on consumer technology that we have in our pockets every day.
So I'll tackle privacy first, and,
Sure.
and it's a really hard one. I mean, first of all, you have to basically realize that you are going to be in some sorts of surveillance mechanisms, no matter what. It's just part of living in modern society. Because of the video feeds, because you have a picture on your license at the DMV. This is just, you can't opt out unless you want to go live, in a farm in the middle of nowhere with no power and never fly anywhere and not have any money or bank accounts. So, I mean, part of it is just like, okay, this is life. And it's not necessarily terrible. To a much greater degree, what I think is critical is where you can, controlling your exposure or controlling how much of your privacy you are giving up. And it's quixotic, but I mean, for example, we have chosen not to put our kids' images on social media because we wanted to give them, I'm assuming anything that goes on social media is going to get facial recognition slapped on it by hook or by crook. So we have chosen to give them the choice. And you can do that for yourself as well, too. I mean, just realize that anytime you post stuff in social media, you might as well, it's just like an email. You might as well assume that everyone will have access to it and see it. So you're kind of ceding your privacy that way. So like the first step to privacy is be aware of what you're doing that will potentially, reduce your privacy.
Sure.
The second step, Facebook makes it pretty hard to police your privacy. So you can go in and tweak your preferences, tweak all of the things about what data they have for you. Or you can just be a whole lot more mindful of what you're doing on Facebook. So don't post things about, like, if there's something sensitive and you worry about it, don't post things about your depression or that, you were diagnosed with cancer or things like that. Now, don't get me wrong, because Facebook can be a tremendous support group for that if you're comfortable with it. But just be very aware that, these are your private things and they're probably going to be gone once you put them up anywhere. I also personally use things like VPNs, which makes it harder. And I enable do not track on every browser that I use.
Okay.
It's not perfect. It does scramble things. It means you deal with more CAPTCHAs, which are a pain in the butt. But it's actually gotten pretty easy. I have a VPN that runs with my password wallet. And whenever I'm on a network that I don't trust or don't know, I run it. Oh. And that gives you a good amount of ability to control what's happening. Another piece that I just think people should really keep in mind is that on the one hand, I find the huge collection of our private likes and intents to be unpleasant. It's pretty much nothing compared to what the credit agencies are doing. And nobody asks questions about that at all.
Yeah.
I mean, you go look at your credit file and then you go look at what Facebook has you doing, and it's an eye opener.
Interesting.
But that's not even questions being asked, which I personally don't understand. I would think that we would have, I mean, you can control your credit file, but man, have you ever been through dispute processes with them? I mean, you'd rather have a hole drilled in your head than have to deal with like the phone calls and this and that and the faxes, and it's
interesting.
So but I mean, I think like that's one thing, like that's part of this sort of maelstrom that we get whipped into, which is like, oh, this online privacy is horrible. It's a terrible risk. And it is, but go look at your credit file and see how you feel about that. In terms of actual control over yourself and your life, the first thing that I try to determine is this actually toxic? So if you really feel a lot worse after you spend time on Twitter or Facebook, or you are skipping things or missing time that you really would have liked to spend doing other things, recognize that and just stop. If you're not like that, which is me, I mean, I'm somewhat active on Twitter. I don't use Facebook anymore, but I enjoy reading what people post on Twitter. Try to make sure that you understand why it's enjoyable to you, and try to maximize that. So like, I filter out people pretty aggressively who I don't want to hear from.
Sure.
And it's not that I dislike them personally. I just don't want to read what they're posting. And so I think that to that extent, what I'm really talking about is controlling your environment and controlling your setting, which all goes back to this idea of freedom, and freedom to be creative, freedom to be happy, not saying put your head in the sand, but, Facebook, Twitter, all of these things, to design it so that it's something that you feel comfortable with and are happy with. Like in the book, one of the examples was a prominent venture capitalist who decided to take his social apps off his phone because he thought he was looking at them too much on his phone. That's smart, right? Well, it's something that I do, which I talk about in the book, is I do not bring the phone in the bedroom, because I just don't necessarily want to look at the phone or think about it when I'm trying to sleep. And I don't want to wake up in the middle of the night and feel the urge of like, oh, did somebody email me from China that I need to talk to, or something like that. So this is all about environment design and life design. Easier said than done, but at the same time, the simpler you can make it, the easier that you can turn it into a short set of rules. Generally, the more successful you will be at this. I personally believe.
Well, Alex, I really appreciate you, as I said, writing the books and coming here on the show. I love the discussion. I think it's fascinating. You certainly, this is happening as we speak. And so I think you certainly have a number of books on this topic to keep coming, more sequels as they come. And I really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you so much, Curt. I was really happy to be here.
Thanks a lot, Alex.